Reason about habit, struggles and surrender for 12 seconds. I want to begin by sharing with you an honest look at a habit that slowly took hold of my life. A habit that I now know was never meant to be a part of who I was called to be. In the quiet moments before sunrise, or during those long reflective evenings, I began to notice this pattern creeping in. It started out so subtly that I barely recognized it. A little distraction here, a little escape there. Nothing seemed harmful at first, but over time, what began as a minor indulgence became a constant companion, an uninvited guest that crowded my thoughts, my decisions, and my days. At first, I didn't even realize how deeply it was embedding itself in my heart and mind. I found myself clinging to it during moments of stress or uncertainty, as if it were a lifeline, even though deep down I sensed that it was pulling me further away from the life I was meant to live. I watched as it chipped away at my focus, my energy, and even my relationship with the very purpose I was created for. This wasn't the plan. It wasn't the design that God had lovingly and meticulously laid out for me. Instead, it was a habit that crept in, unbidden and unchecked, until its grip felt almost impossible to loosen. There were days when the weight of it was almost unbearable. I'd catch myself in the mirror, wondering how I had let something so seemingly insignificant take such a toll on my spirit. I started to notice the ripple effects, strained relationships with those I loved, a restless mind that struggled to find peace, and a heart that was slowly hardening under the strain of guilt and shame. Every morning became a battle between the urge to succumb to that old familiar pattern and the desire to rise above it, to embrace the better version of myself that I knew God intended me to be. It wasn't just about a series of bad choices, it was about a disconnect from the truth of who I was. I had allowed this habit to shape my identity, to define my actions in a way that wasn't reflective of the hope and love that God had planted in me. I was losing sight of the promise of transformation that lies in surrender. I began to understand that this habit, which once seemed like a harmless escape, was actually a barrier, a wall between me and the fullness of life that God was offering. In those moments of deep reflection, I asked myself tough questions. How did I let this happen? What was it about my circumstances that allowed this habit to take root? And most importantly, how could I reclaim the freedom and joy that I knew was my birthright? The answers weren't simple, and they didn't come overnight. They required a level of honesty and introspection that I had been avoiding for too long. I had to confront the uncomfortable truth that the habit was not merely a personal failing, but a misalignment with God's perfect design for my life. It was a detour, a deviation from the path of true fulfillment and purpose. I recall the nights I spent wrestling with these thoughts, feeling both the burden of my choices and the faint, persistent whisper of hope that urged me to seek change. I realized that I had been trying to fix something on my own, relying solely on my willpower and determination, only to find myself locked in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. That's when the light began to break through the darkness. A realization that I needed to lean not on my own strength, but on the grace of God, who knew me better than I knew myself. I recognized that my habit was not just an error in judgment. It was a sign that I needed to let go and allow a divine transformation to take place. It's one thing to acknowledge the existence of a habit, but it's another to see the profound impact it has on every aspect of your life. I began to see that this habit had become a barrier to my dreams, a distraction from the purpose I was meant to pursue. I felt a deep longing for the days when my spirit was unburdened, when I was in tune with the rhythm of life that God intended for me. A life marked by clarity, passion, and an unwavering connection to the divine. I knew that if I were to reclaim that life, I had to confront this habit head-on, admitting its power over me, and then, with prayer and surrender, asking God to take it away. That moment of asking was both humbling and liberating. It wasn't about simply wishing for a different outcome. It was about recognizing that I was not meant to be shackled by this habit any longer. I was ready to let go of something that was never part of His design, to step into the freedom and abundance that awaited me on the other side of surrender. Keep believing that transformation is possible. Reason for 5 seconds. Every day felt like stepping into a storm, where the battle inside me was relentless and unyielding. I'd wake up with a heaviness in my heart, knowing that the habit had already woven itself into the fabric of my daily life. It wasn't that I didn't want to break free. Oh, how I longed to see a new day without its grip. But every time I reached for a fresh start, that old familiar urge would knock on my door, whispering promises of temporary relief. In those moments, it seemed as if the habit had a life of its own, one that was stronger than my will, louder than my hopes, and more persistent than any effort I could muster on my own. I remember the countless nights I sat alone, wrestling with the understanding that my own strength was simply not enough. It was in those quiet hours, when the world was asleep and I was left with nothing but my thoughts, that the truth became painfully clear. I was fighting a battle that I couldn't win without help. Every time I tried to overcome it on my own, I felt like I was standing in quicksand. No matter how hard I struggled, I only sank deeper. I began to see that this habit wasn't just a bad choice. It had become a chain that tied me to a past I desperately wanted to leave behind. There were days when the habit would overwhelm me so completely that I'd feel paralyzed, caught between the desire for change and the suffocating comfort of what I already knew. I'd lie awake at night, my mind replaying every moment of weakness, every instance of surrender to that familiar pattern, and I'd feel a deep, gnawing sense of despair. I knew that I was capable of so much more, that deep down inside there was a spark of something beautiful. A longing to live a life that wasn't dictated by an unhealthy cycle. Yet, every time I tried to fan that spark into a flame, the habit would snuff it out, leaving me in darkness. It wasn't until I reached a point of utter exhaustion that I realized I had been trying to carry this burden all by myself. I had been clinging to the illusion that sheer determination, sheer human will could break this cycle. And while there were moments when I felt proud of the small victories I managed to snatch away, each win was quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming power of the habit. I was caught in a cycle of self-reliance that kept me from ever truly surrendering to something greater than my own strength. That's when it hit me. The moment I finally acknowledged that I couldn't win this battle on my own was the moment I began to understand the depth of my need for divine intervention. In those moments of vulnerability, I came face to face with the raw truth of my humanity. I wasn't weak because I had a habit. I was weak because I believed that my personal effort alone could undo the work of something that had taken hold of my very soul. I realized that it wasn't just a matter of willpower, it was a matter of letting go and allowing something higher to step in and do what I couldn't. And that was a humbling realization, one that shattered the pride I had clung to for so long. I began to see that this inner battle was not a punishment but a calling, a call to surrender, to recognize that I needed to lean not on my own strength, but on the power of a grace that was greater than any habit. It took time, countless moments of prayer and reflection, and a willingness to admit my shortcomings, but slowly I started to understand that true transformation begins with acknowledging your limits. It's in the honest admission of our own frailty that we open the door for divine strength to flow in. Every step I took away from that habit was not a step I made alone. It was a step made possible by a strength that surpassed all my own. There were days when the struggle still felt overwhelming, and I had to remind myself that every setback was simply a part of the process, a moment to pause, pray, and then rise again. I learned that it was okay to feel weak, because weakness is the very place where God's power shines bright. In admitting my inability to break free on my own, I began to experience a peace and a resilience that I had never known before. It is in these honest, raw moments of inner battle that I discovered a truth I hold close to my heart. Our human effort can only take us so far, but it is through surrender and trust that we unlock the door to true healing and transformation. Keep believing that transformation is possible. There comes a moment in life when you realize that you can't keep walking in circles, trapped in the same patterns, weighed down by the same burdens. I reached that moment one evening when I finally admitted to myself that this habit, this thing I had allowed to take root in my life, was never going to leave unless I made a decision. I had spent so much time wrestling with it, trying to manage it, excusing it, convincing myself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed, but deep down, I knew the truth. I knew that no matter how many times I tried to control it, it was controlling me. I knew that if I truly wanted to be free, I had to stop trying to fight it on my own. I had to surrender. That night, I found myself in the quiet, sitting with the weight of my choices, with the realization that I had been carrying this burden for far too long. And in that moment of exhaustion, of frustration, of desperation, I prayed. But this wasn't just any prayer. This wasn't one of those prayers where you ask God to help you get through another day, another week, another round of trying to fix things on your own. No, this was different. This was surrender. I didn't ask for the strength to resist the habit. I didn't ask for the willpower to overcome it. I simply asked God to take it away. I had never prayed like that before. Up until that point, my prayers had always included a little bit of me holding on, a little bit of me still wanting control. But this time, I let go. I let go of the idea that I could manage this on my own. I let go of the belief that I just needed to be stronger, more disciplined, more determined. I let go of my pride, my fear, my excuses, and I simply asked God to take what I could no longer carry. And something happened in that moment. It wasn't a dramatic, earth-shaking experience. The room didn't suddenly fill with light, and I didn't feel an instant, overwhelming rush of change. But what I did feel was peace. A deep, unshakable peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to fix myself. I wasn't trying to figure it all out. I had given it to God, and I knew beyond any doubt that He had heard me. From that day forward, something inside me shifted. It wasn't that the habit magically disappeared overnight. It was still there, still whispering, still trying to pull me back. But there was a difference now. The difference was that I no longer felt alone in the fight. The difference was that every time I felt the temptation creeping in, I didn't try to push through it with my own strength. Instead, I turned to God. Every single time, I prayed the same prayer, take it away. And slowly I began to see what surrender really meant. Surrender wasn't about giving up. It was about giving over. It was about realizing that I was never meant to fight this battle alone. It was about trusting that God wasn't just listening to my prayers. He was moving in ways I couldn't even see. And as I leaned into that trust, as I made it my first response instead of my last resort, the habit started to lose its grip. There were still difficult days, moments when I felt weak, moments when I was tempted to believe that nothing had really changed. But I held on to the promise that if I kept surrendering, if I kept trusting, if I kept choosing to turn to God instead of turning back to the habit, freedom was inevitable. And I began to see it happening. Little by little, I saw myself becoming someone new. I saw my desires changing, my thoughts shifting, my heart aligning with the life God had always intended for me. And that's when I understood something I had never realized before. True freedom doesn't come from trying harder. It doesn't come from guilt or shame or sheer willpower. True freedom comes when you finally lay it all down, when you stop trying to carry the weight on your own and instead place it in the hands of the one who was always meant to carry it for you. Keep believing that transformation is possible. Something changed the moment I truly surrendered. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. I had spent so much time asking God to take my habit away, and for the first time, I wasn't just asking, I was trusting. I had let go of the illusion that I could control the outcome. And in return, I started to notice something I hadn't seen before. Small moments, small victories, little shifts in my thoughts, my actions, my desires. At first, they were almost too subtle to recognize. A moment where I would have normally fallen back into old patterns, but instead, I felt the strength to walk away. A day where I didn't feel the overwhelming pull of the habit as strongly as before. A night where I laid my head down without the familiar weight of guilt pressing against my chest. These were things I had overlooked before, times when I would have told myself that nothing had really changed. But now I saw them for what they were, evidence. Evidence that God was moving, that He was answering my prayer, that He was slowly but surely replacing what I had surrendered with something far greater. There was a new awareness growing in me, a realization that the process of transformation wasn't about perfection, but about progress. I had spent so much time believing that change had to be instant, that if I truly wanted to be free, it had to happen all at once. But that wasn't how God was working. He was leading me step by step, moment by moment, showing me that real change is built in the small, daily choices. I didn't need to see the entire road ahead. I just needed to take the next step. And that's exactly what I did. Each time I noticed one of those small victories, I leaned into it. I let it remind me that I wasn't doing this alone. I let it strengthen my faith. Let it reinforce the truth that God was doing something new in me. And slowly, the habit that once felt like an unbreakable chain began to loosen its grip. The temptation didn't hold the same power. The struggle didn't feel as impossible. The weight I had carried for so long was getting lighter. But even as I moved forward, there were still moments of doubt, moments where I questioned if I was really changing or if it was just temporary. It's easy to doubt progress when the journey feels slow. It's easy to let the old voice creep in, whispering that you'll never fully be free. But every time those thoughts came, I reminded myself of the truth. God doesn't start something He doesn't intend to finish. He doesn't bring us halfway just to leave us stranded. He doesn't give us glimpses of freedom only to let us fall back into captivity. So I held on. I celebrated every small step, every moment of strength, every time I resisted the pull of my past. I stopped looking at how far I still had to go and started focusing on how far I had already come. I let go of the pressure to be perfect and embraced the process of becoming. And with each passing day, I felt the shift happening, not just in my actions, but in my heart. Where there was once frustration, there was now patience. Where there was once guilt, there was now grace. Where there was once a cycle of failure and regret, there was now a quiet confidence that I was walking in a new direction. And it wasn't just about breaking a habit, it was about stepping into a new identity. I was no longer someone struggling to let go. I was someone learning to live in freedom. And that is what true transformation looks like. It's not about waking up one day and never facing the struggle again. It's about waking up and knowing that each day is another step toward the life you were meant to live. It's about trusting that even in the moments where progress feels slow, even in the moments of struggle, God is still working. He is still moving. He is still replacing the old with something new, something better, something lasting. Keep believing that transformation is possible. There was a time when I believed that if God was truly taking my habit away, then I wouldn't feel its pull anymore. I thought that true freedom meant never having to face the temptation again, never feeling that familiar whisper trying to call me back. But as I walked through this journey, I realized something important. The presence of temptation does not mean the absence of change. For so long, I assumed that if I was still tempted, it meant I was failing. I thought it meant that I wasn't strong enough, that my faith wasn't deep enough, that maybe I hadn't truly let go. But the truth is, temptation isn't proof of failure, it's proof of transformation. Because every time I faced it, every time the old habit tried to resurface and pull me back, I had a choice I didn't have before. Before I gave in without thinking. It was automatic, a pattern so deeply ingrained that I barely recognized it happening until it was too late. But now, something was different. Now, when the temptation came, I saw it for what it was. It was no longer an irresistible force controlling me. It was simply a moment where I could choose to go back or keep moving forward. And that realization changed everything, because I began to understand that freedom isn't about never being tempted. Freedom is about knowing that temptation no longer has power over you. It's about recognizing that you are no longer bound to respond the way you once did. It's about seeing the same old battles and realizing that you now have the strength to win them. I won't pretend it was easy. There were days when the pull felt strong, moments where I had to remind myself over and over again that I was no longer a prisoner to my past. And there were even moments where I stumbled, where I let my guard down and found myself facing the weight of regret again. But even in those moments, I learned something important. One mistake does not erase progress. One moment of weakness does not undo everything that God has been doing. In the past, falling back into the habit would have sent me spiraling into shame, convinced that I would never change. But now I saw it differently. Now I understood that setbacks are not the same as failures. A setback is just a moment, and what matters most is what comes after. Do I let it define me? Do I let it pull me back into the cycle? Or do I get back up, remind myself of who I am becoming, and keep moving forward? I chose to move forward. I chose to see each temptation not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity. An opportunity to prove to myself that I was no longer the person I used to be. An opportunity to rely on God's strength instead of my own. An opportunity to remind myself that I was walking in a new direction, one step at a time. And as I did, something incredible began to happen. The more I resisted, the weaker the temptation became. What once felt like an unstoppable force now felt like a shadow, something that could only affect me if I gave it permission. The more I said no, the less power it had over me. The more I turned to God in those moments, the stronger I became. It's easy to believe that real change means never struggling again. But the truth is, real change is knowing that the struggle no longer controls you. It's understanding that even when temptation knocks, you don't have to open the door. And the more you choose to walk in freedom, the more natural it becomes. Until one day, you realize that what once held you captive no longer even interests you. That is the power of transformation. Not that the temptation disappears, but that it no longer defines you. Not that the habit is erased from memory, but that it no longer has a hold on your future. That is what true freedom looks like. And when you reach that place, you understand that the struggle was never meant to break you. It was meant to show you just how strong you've become. Keep believing that transformation is possible. There came a moment when I realized I was no longer looking over my shoulder, no longer waiting for the weight of my past to catch up with me, no longer expecting failure at every turn. For so long, I had defined myself by my struggle. It had been a part of me for so long that I wasn't sure who I was without it. Even as I walked in freedom, there was a part of me that hesitated to believe it was real, as if at any moment everything could come crashing down again. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, God had been leading me somewhere all along, not just away from my habit, but into something greater. I had spent so much time asking God to take my habit away, and He had been faithful. He had given me the strength to overcome, the wisdom to recognize the traps that once held me, and the grace to keep going even when I stumbled. But what I hadn't realized was that this journey wasn't just about what I was leaving behind, it was about what I was stepping into. Because when God takes something away, He doesn't leave us empty. He doesn't just remove a struggle and leave a void. He replaces it. He fills the space with something new, something better, something that brings life instead of destruction. And as I continued to walk forward, I started to see it happening. Where there was once addiction, there was now discipline. Where there was once shame, there was now purpose. Where there was once a constant battle, there was now peace. It wasn't just about breaking free from the habit, it was about becoming the person I was meant to be. For so long I had let that habit define me. I had believed that it was just a part of who I was, something I would always have to carry. But that was never true. That was never my identity. My identity was never in my struggle. It was never in my failures. It was never in the mistakes I had made or the battles I had fought. My identity had always been in something greater, in someone greater. And when I finally understood that, everything changed. I no longer saw myself as someone trying to escape their past. I saw myself as someone walking toward their future, A future that was no longer weighed down by the chains of addiction, fear or regret. A future that wasn't about constantly fighting to stay free, but about embracing the freedom that had already been given to me. I wish I could tell you that this journey is easy, that once you surrender, everything falls into place and the struggle disappears forever. But the truth is, growth takes time. Healing takes time. Becoming who you were meant to be takes time. But every step forward is worth it. Every choice to trust God instead of giving in is worth it. Every time you refuse to go back to what once held you, you are choosing a life far greater than anything you could have imagined. And that's what I want you to understand. This isn't just about breaking free from something. It's about stepping into something greater. It's about realizing that you were never meant to live in bondage, never meant to be defined by your struggle. You were meant to live in purpose, in peace, in the fullness of what God has for you. Looking back now, I don't just see the struggle, I see the transformation. I don't just see the pain, I see the purpose that came from it. And I know that every battle, every tear, every moment of doubt was leading me here, to this moment, to this life, to this freedom that is no longer something I am chasing, but something I am living. And if He did it for me, He can do it for you. Keep believing that transformation is possible.